Jesse, owner of KiS Organics. I host a cannabis cultivation science podcast. I got started because my parents owned a plant nursery growing up, and then my father, when they sold that after 30 years, they started a compost tea business. I've been around sort of plants and soil biology pretty much my whole life. I came into it after coming back from Australia with a master's degree. I got back into the business and kind of been going from there. And I think the most exciting thing for me is the opportunity to always learn more with a new crop, which is cannabis. That's really exciting. And the idea that we might be able to bridge the gap between the research that's happening right now in academia and what's going on in the field in cultivation with growers. So that's, I think that's the biggest challenge. And also the most exciting thing is like we can actually participate in actively learning more about this crop. And there's very few crops left that we can say that about. So that's it for me.
Thank you. Who'd like to go next? Brandon?
I can go. I'm Brandon Hudson. I work for KiS Organics. I do the bulk of the soil analysis. I love cannabis. I've been around this plant my whole life. My parents grew weed. I had a teepee when I was 4 made out of stalks from a harvest. So I've been around it my whole life. I was talking to Tad's dad yesterday. I've just never had any kind of uncomfortability about it or anything. It was just something that was like salt and pepper in my environment growing up. And so, you know, it was always the constant reminders, don't tell anybody. And so I've been growing as an adult on my own for 39 years now. This is my 39th year. And I've done deep water culture, rock wool slabs, cocoa, all the salt stuff, and, you know, coliseums, all that. I've done large scale facilities in South Carolina with hemp, both indoor and outdoor. I would say the biggest challenge for organics would be heavy metals. You know, when we look at numbers that small, parts per billion, we look at the almost infinite number of opportunities for some sort of contamination along the way in the testing, even after the sample's been looked at. So I feel like getting some real national guidelines for how that should be done properly, how the testing should be done properly, the water, all that kind of stuff. I feel like that's the biggest challenge for us.
Cool. Andrew?
Like that hat, Brandon.
I had to represent, man. I'm trying to cover up the 6 heads so I don't blind anybody. So
so I started growing maybe 14 years ago in Alaska. I moved to Alaska and I had just been getting really good Blue Dream from Cali medical scene. And then when I went to Alaska, not as much imports up there, and the people that I knew did not know how to grow. So very quickly we realized if we were going to get good stuff, we were going to have to grow it ourselves. First apartment, someone just brought over a bunch of plants. I threw a light into a closet. I was doing peat moss and compost teas and some bat guano teas. And then we got evicted from that apartment for growing. And so I ended up realizing I had to rent a house. Then we got into a house and started getting some cool genetics over from Amsterdam and some of the stuff in the overseas, like Attitude Seed Bank. And, you know, then I started to realize how important genetics were, because the first time I ever grew, I think it was Chocolate crossed with Kosher Kush. It was just a part of anything I'd ever smoked before. And I knew I wasn't that good at growing, so it had to be something else. And then slowly but surely just kind of switched craft and went more and more organic, less bottled nutrients, until I actually learned how to grow in living soil through Tad's podcast, and then ended up meeting Tad and coming to work for the business. So it's been a it's been a great ride. And I think my biggest struggles over the years was learning how to water in living soil. It's so different when you switch from a sterile media. I'd always had great success with the bottles, and then my first grow, I overwatered pretty bad in living organics, and the plants just looked horrible.
Thank you. And
But
Ben?
I've seen them lately. They don't look horrible anymore. So. Yeah, my name's Ben. It's kind of funny. I spent a lot of time learning about stuff, so I haven't actually grown too much. I actually didn't even jump into this industry until about 2018. And before that time, I was legitimately underwater. I was scuba diving and hanging out with moray eels and doing my research on marine ecology. So, long story short, we moved up into the Olympia area. My brother-in-law at the time, still does, but has expanded, owns a tier 2 cultivation facility. And I called him up and I said, hey, I'm looking for a gig, but in the meantime, would you like a scientific eye on any of this stuff? And he said, well, that doesn't exist currently in the industry. So sure. So I was like, okay. And then I took a year essentially of just keeping my mouth shut, acting like a gardener, learning the plant, learning the system. I was a bit lucky with the fact that they do grow in living soil, organic, sustainable kind of approach. And that soil was KiS Organics. That's how I kind of met Tad. It was actually pretty funny. I remember when Nate and I were talking, the owner of Gold Leaf, he was like, yeah, I'd love to have you up here, but you got to kind of have an idea of what's going on. So if you could, this is while I was still living and working in Santa Cruz. He said, yeah, take a listen to this podcast. It's by a friend of mine named Tad Hussey. And so at that time, I was still in academia. So I have a whole booklet of just all the notes from all those first, I don't know, 30, 40, 50 episodes. And I was just trying to study and learn like I knew how. And then, yeah, I started really kind of getting into the growing in 2018. My kind of soapbox / feeling about cannabis is, funny enough, I think it's going to be one of the main crops that saves agriculture. I know that sounds kind of hyperbolic, but we're lucky enough to have a crop that's got so much margin that we can really play with stuff. Whether that's irrigation, lighting, all these other things. A lot of other industries don't have that kind of margin to really push and test the limits. So I think when things start getting more complicated as far as growing kind of crops outdoors that we've normally done, I think people are going to have to look at how to do things indoors. And those who want to do things sustainably and organically will have a very logical place to look. And that's folks like us. The hardest thing about growing cannabis, this was something that I wrestled with doing during my heavy learning phase, which is especially coming out of a place that was always looking for primary literature, trying to find empirical data and research about cultivation practices it just doesn't exist. It's starting to now. Sure, like medicinal and psycho effects, like there's plenty of research on that, but actually how to benefit the plant more and get more holistic properties out of it, there's very little on that. So that was frustrating, but it was also very exciting where we kind of get to forge that road and do it. So it's been fascinating, it's been exciting. Very rarely, I feel very lucky to have landed in an industry that doesn't have a whole lot of previous work on it. So it's great. It's super exciting, and I feel really lucky to have landed where I am.
Thank you, Ben. So we have another question from Margaret. She asks, what cultivars do you prefer to grow and why? And how do you find, determine, and test out cultivars? It's probably a good one for Andrew and Brandon. So Andrew, would you like to start?
Yeah, or Brandon can go. My answer might get pretty long here. This is kind of like my jam to my peanut butter.
All right. Okay. Sounds good.
Yeah, I can give my short answer and then Andrew can elucidate on that. I'm primarily growing indoor, so that is a huge factor just immediately right out the gate for what cultivars I'm gonna grow. You have to look for something that is a manageable structure and time length based on your environment. So, you always want to match the hatch. And so if you're in Southern California and you want to grow some haze plants outside, that makes perfect sense to me. You'll have a long enough season, you'll have the right weather, probably kind of what Ben was alluding to earlier. Like, we're going to be indoor for growing eventually. The weather's getting just too unpredictable. But so with me, I'm trying to be able to provide information and support for facilities. Most of those facilities need an 8 or a 9 week production plant. So a lot of my decisions are made so that I can support the growers. So I stick to, those 8, 9 week plants for the most part. There's some stuff like GMO, there's some hazes that I love. They just take too long. So that is a situation where it might be worth it for me to grow one plant outdoor, pull tarps on it, something like that. But for the most part, I'm looking for something that will finish on time and something that has a short structure but gives me the yields that I'm looking for. And then beyond that, it's just a matter of personal taste. Some people like the real sedative couch lock stuff. That I don't really enjoy that. I don't, I'm already hungry and tired. I don't need more of that in my life. So I like energetic, laughy, communicative strains. I like strains that I can do math on. I like strains that I hate to say it, but it's really hard to get high. I just, I smoke too much. And so I've got a really high tolerance. And so I'm really looking for terpenes. It's a piece of candy. It's just like it's candy throughout the day that I just love the taste of it. I feel like I can smell good cannabis and it just changes my mood. Just being in a room with a bunch of good cannabis. I was at a harvest yesterday, tangy terps for days, as far as you could smell, it was just tangy terps. And it was great, and I didn't even feel like smoking. I was just in a great mood. And so for me, I'm trying to match my environment. I want to find something that fits the space. I can get an adequate yield. And we're always looking for, I love Justin McGill's dad's like 3-step joint process of like, he likes to take a dry toke and get that pure terpene. Then he said he likes to light it, but he'll just light it like this. He won't draw through it because he says he likes to do the wave test, like as though he's at a concert. He's like, I want to have that best smelling weed in the concert. And so I don't tend personally to pick for medicinal value, although I do use cannabis for pain management. I've broken most of the bones in my body, and it helps with migraines. It helps with all that stuff for me, but I'm not specifically chasing any one medicinal cannabinoid profile or anything like that.
Can I just add something really small to that? One other consideration to think about is we know that there's certain plants that now have genes that will make them more resistant to powdery mildew, for example. Or when you go into a commercial room, you'll see some plants that won't express hop latent viroid, but others will. And so because of the genetic variability in cannabis, selecting plants that are better for your environment, like Brandon alluded at, can go a long ways towards finishing. I mean, here in Washington, with all the rains we get, outdoors is really challenging. So that's just something that I want to always keep in the back of my mind when I'm picking what genetics I'm going to run.
Yeah, and just to dovetail back into what Tad just said, if I go into a room and there's, Like I was in a room yesterday with probably 12 different cultivars, big room. And let's say 11 of them are doing great. And one of them's, for whatever reason, you're seeing a trace element issue, or I think it's the white star dog over at Mako that always finishes with a manganese, very visible manganese issue. For me, if I've got a plant that's, I mean, it would have to be real roadkill skunk. It would have to be like one of the holy grail cultivars that's gone now for me to be willing to deal with or baby a cultivar that was, not responding well within the average targets that we work with. So that's another consideration. If I have outliers that just don't perform well in my environment, my MPK, whatever, I'll get rid of them.
Andrew, do you want to jump in?
So I'm a little bit unique. Most people with my kind of disposition towards cannabis don't enjoy it. But I'm very, very sensitive to sedative effects, kind of like what Brandon was saying. I wake up tired and hungry. I don't need any help in that department. So for me, I'm looking for things that really invigorate and seeming to help with creativity, inspirational, motivational things, things of that sort. And then along with some kind of overall feeling of wellness, or like he said, like giggles, or, if I can determine that, then that's usually what I'm looking for in a cultivar. But what I've found is the modern day genetics don't usually offer that for me. If something is going to flower in 8 to 9 weeks, it almost always leaves me dragging. So I personally prefer combinations of landrace and what I would call legendary varieties that just have outstanding flavor, resin production, varieties that have stayed and stuck around through all the different hype kind of cycles that cannabis goes through. For example, Chem 91 and Congo Lease, or any African, really. I love the different African varieties, but the Chem 91 crossed with Congo, they just go very well together. The African landrace provides a unique, energetic, almost heart racing sensation, while the Chem adds a certain potency and flavor, just mix really well together, and it levels out the Chem, so the Chem doesn't take you under if you smoke too often. But at the same time, the African can be too intense for some people, and they don't want to feel that like hot heart racing sensation. But
I
for
have
me,
to admit, I like the speedy paranoid side of weed. So I'm just going to tell on myself. I like that. So
yeah, no, me too. I don't like if I smoke, I want to like go for a walk, or like you said, go do some math, or like maybe even think about the next cross I want to make, or what genetics I think are going to go good together. But if my mind is hindered, or I just feel overall lethargic, it's not fun for me. And so another thing I love are hazes for that very reason. A haze is one of the very few cultivars that already has potency and almost a spiritual effect mixed with some kind of psychedelic high. Hazes are very different from anything I've ever smoked. And then me and Brandon have also found that when sour diesel is mixed in with the true haze genetic, just the flower structure increases, the smells are way better, the flavor is off the charts. It's really hard to come up with something that does better than a sour diesel haze. So those are things like I would keep in my garden forever. And then I like to experiment with other landrace varieties just to see what it is. Like personally, I've found Pakistani crossed with Honduras, crossed with Congo will give you almost a psychedelic haze effect, but it's much more like a soft daydream. And then it can just totally blot out hours from your day. So for me, it's really cool. It's a really unique experience. It doesn't get heavy, but I don't always grow that because I don't want to lose hours of my day. Good one for like a
Amnesia
Sunday.
haze will do that. Amnesia haze will do that to you. Like six
That
hours
stuff
later,
is
you're like, I know I did something, but I don't know what or with who.
yeah. So
But it was pretty
I've been
fun. I'm sure it was fun.
trying to find the balance between something like amnesia haze where it's like your whole day's gone, and then something like Honduras where it's like 2 hours are gone, and it can be good and functional for a Sunday when you don't have to get anything done. But I'm not going to grow it time and time again because it doesn't have the same energetic productivity like an African mixed with a haze would. And then when I'm hunting seeds, like how do I find, determine, test out a cultivar? I'm a huge fan of microbreeding. So I always run tiny pots first. So if you're looking to really suss out a population, microbreeding is very useful. Or if you're looking to, let's say, hunt 12 different cultivars and you have 12 seeds of each, you can do all that at one time in a 4x4 tent, and then you can look at these different variations. And once you put them against the whole population, it's a lot easier to see a standout. Whereas if you're only growing 4 plants in a bed and you have 80, 100,000 seeds to work through, it's going to take the rest of your life. And each seed is like a lottery ticket. So you might not find anything worthwhile. And you might think you found something cool, when really that's not even what that line has to offer. You just had a really good grow. So, of course, a plant is going to look great and smell great if your grow is on point, which
So
is why
are you flowering all those out like immediately and then re-vegging them? Or are you like growing them enough to clone them then? And then, because like if you just flower it out, don't leave anything to re-veg, you're going to lose that, right?
ideally you would clone before flower. But
Okay.
if you're low on space and all you have to work with is a 4x4 tent, you can re-veg. You just have to do what I call a quick flip. If you take them more than 2 or 3 weeks in, depending on the variety, it's going to be very hard to bring them back out. But if you have an eye for it and you can determine a few characteristics that you're looking for, you can call out a lot of the population in that first 2 weeks just based on your runts, things that are, like Brandon said, showing a random deficiency, things that just don't want to get going, things that don't stretch at all, or things that stretch too much. You can really see a lot in the first 2 weeks of flower. And then when you bring them back, you can up pot. Let's say you go from 200 down to 20 after those first 2 weeks. It's a lot more manageable to clone the resulting 20 plants and then continue testing further on. So you can at least pick out your girls and the type of structure that you want. And then you can dig back in and really look for that standout among those 20, maybe let's say 1 gallon pots or a bed.
I saw really interesting yesterday just on the re-veg topic. So Justin's been running this grapefruit strain for over a decade, and they used to re-veg it. And it's at a point now where it will only throw on 3 leaves, no matter how mature the plant gets, no matter how big the mom gets. And so they're actually going back through tissue culture to, I guess, reverse that so that the plant will grow properly. And so that's how they're going to get around it. So I just thought that was really interesting because I've always had pretty good results, luck with re-vegging plants. But in a perfect world, I prefer to label all the moms, take cuts off of them. I've got my cuts, flower the moms out, then, decide who I want to keep. And I've kind of fallen in love with this Super Silver Haze Sour Diesel, but I try not to fall in love with any one cultivar. I just threw that whole pillowcase full of seeds out there just to show like I've got a lot of genetics. Like I've got millions of beans. And so I'm always popping something new, always.
Hey, Brandon, can I ask a question?
Yeah.
Hey, why would you? Okay, so if you're popping your seeds and you've got your moms, why would you flower out the mom and keep a cut? Why wouldn't you keep the mom and flower out a cut?
You could do either way. You could do either way. A
Okay,
lot of, like, in my facility, I had a 3,000 square foot head house that was always super short for space, and I had a 60 by 120 greenhouse that there was always,
yeah,
I had so I had most of, I had like almost like 88%, 92% of the floor was accounted for, but I still had
gotcha.
big areas on either end. And so I would just drag a mom over and flower her out. That way I'd get a big yield. It's a nice big healthy plant. I don't have to worry about it since it's not sitting in the best environment. Like, you don't want to stack a bunch of young sensitive plants in front of the wet wall in South Carolina. Like,
I
they
got
might,
you. I got you.
yeah,
I've
yeah.
I've just heard some people say, some conflicting things about, you should always flower out the mom and keep a cut. And I've always been accustomed to keeping the mom, the actual, the seed stock, the mom, and flowering cuts off of that. So, just a question.
The mom is seed stock. She's going to have the F1 vigor, which typically means she's, going to stick around. But I don't keep my moms for more, probably 3 months. 6 months is the max, but I think 3 months is probably better just to keep propagation numbers up and that kind of stuff. You're not carrying
Gotcha.
a load or something along with it. So I just think that works a little bit better for me. But you could do either, and then, like, I don't know, this was months ago, but I had a thing on Instagram, and I don't know if we did it on here or not, but I was showing where I took a bunch of cuts and immediately threw them into 12-12. So I was rooting under 12-12, but I also got to see, I sexed all my greenhouse run that way. So there's so many ways to get there with this plant. It's just fine.
Gotcha. Yeah, because the mom is first generation. It's the first cut that comes off the second generation, right?
Well, it depends. Some people, I got a buddy in Detroit who at this point has had this lights plant for like 37 years. He's had the same mom, which
Oh, wow.
I horrible idea to veg a plant for 37 years. Like,
Yeah.
but I
Yeah.
mean, good on him. Like, that's incredible that he's been able to keep that plant alive. But I don't think that's smart. But
That thing must be,
he's romantically in love with this plant. It's
Uh,
and it's
Yeah,
that thing
generally
must
what-
be like oak at this point.
yeah. Well, it did. This it's like this big around.
Yeah, and you probably couldn't drive a nail through it.
Oh no. I mean, the number of times he's had to chop it off, it's like 8 feet tall, but I mean, it looks like it's like a stump and then like a porcupine. It's crazy.
That's
But
crazy.
This sounds like an urban myth, man. Like one of those stories you hear about.
no,
Oh yeah,
no, I'll reach out to him and get some pictures because
that'd be cool.
That would be awesome. Yeah.
story with this guy. I met him at a Bob Weir show in Detroit in like 95. And right after I had been attacked by a giant pink dragon that came out of the sunset. And yeah. So he saved me that night. I got a really crazy story I don't think I should record, but I'll bring it up.
I was
That's
just gonna
a
add on.
Patreon hangout story. Go
Yeah,
ahead,
right.
Ben. Then I wanted to add something, but go ahead.
Yeah, I was just gonna throw in there. I don't know. Again, like I don't know if there's too much interest in like the facility side of things as opposed to just like your own personal like grow and exploration. But a little context from the facility side of things. I guess the commercial is we're always seed testing, we're always pheno hunting, because if you stop moving in this industry, you're behind yesterday.
Yep.
So if you do have some space, it's really fun to do. Obviously, as long as you're not going to be, putting any stress or strain or pollen on the stuff you don't want it on. But as far as like figuring out, like, for us too, then from a facility standpoint, like we need to try to do this as quick as possible. And just getting to that flowering stage to figure out if it's a male or female can take a long time and use up a bunch of resources that theoretically 50% of those plants will end up dying anyway. So we do sell these LeafWorks kits, these gender kits. In fact, I'll throw them into the chat right now, link to the website, and if you're curious. So that way you basically just take a little leaf, smush a leaf in there, and then send it and mail it in. And they'll get back to you and let you know if you got a male or a female well before you need to take that thing all the way to flower to figure it out on your own. So it helps that process a lot faster early on. And that way you don't have to have as much space in your veg or your pheno hunt space, right? Because you can weed those out, no pun intended, a lot quicker.
I've
Go through them.
had 100% with them.
Yeah.
Yep, I've used them.
The only thing I've ever had happen is I did have one plant herm that I
Yeah.
set, but that's not the test's fault. That the test read correctly. So
Yeah.
So, since we're talking about moms, I know there was another question about moms in general in terms of how to best keep them and what size container and some of that. I thought that might be a good transition. And like you guys touched on, the woody stems is a big thing over time. These plants, every time you take a cut, you know, you're going to end up with more offshoots, and it just becomes a nightmare over time of a plant. Plus, I think the health of the plant and the viability of the plant goes down over time with just continual wounding and pruning when we talk about a long time. But in terms of how people are storing these plants, most of the facilities we work with are organic. So most of them are in a range of containers ranging from, I've seen them as small as 7-gallon, typically 20 or 30-gallon pots. Collective elevation, if you go check out that tour on YouTube, they do 2 plants in a 4x8 bed with a trellis, and it looks awesome. I don't know if the workflow on that is better, but I have to say it's one of the coolest looking mom rooms I've ever seen. So you should definitely check that out. But the challenge on the fertility side with moms is what I want to touch on before you guys jump in. And that's really interesting because, you know, a lot of us with the soil beds, you know, with the way that we like to grow at KiS with beds and re-amending the soil with soil testing every cycle, that's really challenging with moms, especially if you keep moms for more than a cycle or two, because it's one, there's not going to be a lot of soil left in that pot. It's going to be mostly root mass. And 2, managing the fertility in that pot with top dressing is really challenging in terms of keeping that mom healthy. And healthy moms is the most important thing for your facility having success, and even for home growers and having success through flower, starting with like a really healthy clone. If I don't have a healthy mom, I'm not going to start my next cycle. It's that important. That's where little things like fish hydrolysate, a bottled nutrient program with light doses come in really handy, or even something like Jax, like a conventional salt-based fertilizer in small doses. Those things are all just really effective ways to keep your moms healthy. I would much rather, you know, for example, run Jax or use a bottled nutrient line to make sure I'm keeping my fertility up in that 30-gallon pot. My mom looks healthy, than madly trying to top dress as I see deficiencies, knowing that they're not going to get into the plant for another 7 to 10 days. And now my plant's stressed and I'm going to have to take cuttings off of it. So it becomes a real hassle, and to me, it's not worth it. So unless, because every genetics they're all going to be a little bit different. So I can't just say that here's a top dress kit for your moms. And it's going to work for all your moms because of the wide variety of genetics that we have. So that was a good question that was asked in our Q&A list. And that's sort of how I would address it. Does someone else want to add anything or comment on that?
Yes, can I add something? Oops, sorry.
Okay, go on. You go.
Hey, you guys should check out a Grassroots Superfood Veg. It's fish hydrolysate. It's a powder. It's a fish hydrolysate base. It's got CalMag, a bunch of other nutrients in there, and that is exactly what I use to feed my moms. I've got them in 15-gallon fabric Grassroots pots, and they're probably They got to be about 3 foot by 3 foot by 4 foot tall, and I have zero issues. I feed them once a week with their superfood, and then I hit them once a week with what is it, Pacific Grove fish hydrolysate, and
Yeah.
zero nutrient deficiencies, and I mean faster growth than I've seen in hybrid situations, and faster growth than I'm seeing in a soil situation with bottled nutrients. Just my input.
No, how long are you running, Blair?
What's that?
How long are you keeping those moms alive?
So, and I kind of wanted to chime in a couple of minutes ago too, because generally what I do is when I find a pheno that I like, it is my F1, my first generation mom. I probably keep it around for like 6 or 7 months, and then I take a cutting off of it and I mark the tag second generation, and then I'm able to keep that around for like some of them upwards of a year, but I kind of see around like 8, 9, 11, 12 months they kind of start to get finicky, and I think that's that whole fertility thing that you're talking about. Not to mention trying to up pot from a 15 or a 20-gallon pot to like a 30 or 40. It's not feasible.
Yeah, for me, when Dwayne put the question forward, because I work at KiS and because I use KiS soil, I know, and because I regularly rotate my mom at least every 3 months, I know that I can keep a nice, vigorous, healthy plant that was vegged in a 1 gallon. I can throw that into a 10 or a 12-gallon smart pot, and I can run that in KiS biochar, water only, CGM for 3 months, and I'm not going to see any deficiencies. That plant will be fine. As far as the nutrient side of things, calcium and phosphorus are the two that I try to make sure are on point for my moms, just as far as having the best propagation results. So those are the two elements that show up as being an issue if somebody is just if your clones are not rooting, first thing you want to do is get a scope out and look at your moms and make sure you don't have russets or something horrible like that going on. That's definitely something that can happen. You'll see propagation numbers drop off with russets, but you'll also see it drop off with calcium. You'll see it drop off with phosphorus, and then when the environment of the propagation is not ideal, you've got super low relative humidity or something like that. But for me, because I'm doing regularly rotating my moms, I like a 10 or 12-gallon smart pot. I like at least 450 for my PPFD. I'll go as high as 600 for my moms. I feel like that's adequate. And I just try to make sure I have enough to cover my needs. I try to make sure I've got cuts that I don't need sitting around. And I try to make sure I've got cuts before I need them. I would always rather have a plant that's a little bit bigger that I can trim back.
Yeah.
That's that nice big root mass. Because when you've got a small shoots and a giant root mass and you throw it into a bed, it goes crazy. I just did the opposite. Big shoots, almost no roots, and lost power for 2 days. So it got cold, and so everything's just moving a little slowly this time. But as far as metrics, that's what I'm shooting for a mom.
Yeah, for us at the facility, it's we really don't like to let them go more than really 3 months, maybe 4. And the big reason for that is obviously we've got a whole area ready to go for clones, so why not use it for just moms as well? And the thing to think about too, guys, is plants are a lot like us in some respects. Like the hormones change over the years, guys. It sucks, but it happens. When they're young and ready to grow, they're going to be moving stuff all over their body. So taking cuttings from anywhere is going to give you a really good shot at getting some really vigorously ready to go babies. Once those moms get woody and older, it's a lot harder. It's fighting gravity more. Those things get woodier. It's hard. And just the hormones change, right? The plant changes, all that stuff changes. So it's a lot harder to clone off of an older plant, even if it's the healthiest, prettiest, happiest looking thing in the world, just because the starting materials that you want in a clone aren't going to be there in abundance as, you know, using from a younger mom. So it helps to keep them young for sure, as far as your success rate.
Yeah, and I think it's also good to take into consideration that we are growing an annual. So even in the best of conditions, let's say Southern California, you start your season February, they're flowering in August. So that's 6 months. And even by then, I think that's a bit of a long, you know, most people are looking at May to August, which is 3 months. And that plant's just ready to flower. Like, it doesn't want to keep growing. It wants to flower. So I've found that I take biochar soil and I'll either add a couple cups of bloom booster, or I'll just specifically add fishbone and gypsum. And then I keep my mom's in 1 gallons. It's definitely, the bigger the pot, the longer you can keep it happy. But in 1 gallons every 2 months, I take the most atypical branch and I take it down about 8 inches, and then I use that to reset. I've found that they don't skip a beat as long as you use enough plant material and it has dominance, because there's going to be a higher concentration of auxins, and you're kind of taking the brain center of the plant at that point. And then when that goes into the soil and that roots, the amount of growth you're going to see come off of that clone after it's rooted is way more growth than you would see from trying to keep a mom for 6-7 months. But it is more work to continually reset. And if your watering's not on point, those 1 gallon pots can really kill you. So I would say beds are the best, but who's got beds available for each mom? You know what I'm saying?
Now you made me feel better. I'm in like 2-gallon pots, resetting like every 2 to 3 months, basically just trying to get 2 runs out of them. So I'm glad I'm not the only one.
I've done it with jacks and solo cups, you know, like I was just doing hydroponically, you know. So
Yeah.
I mean, depending on how you feed it, there's really no limit.
We had a question on IG from Eco Thrift saying, I'm noticing a trend away from the standard 18-inch grassroots make towards shallow 12-inch and 10-inch. And I've also seen a few facilities use taller 24-inch beds, which seems excessive. So the question he's asking is, when planning to use beds, what considerations should be taken into account for the bed depth?
Inches, 10 to 12 inches. It's just, for me, the analogy I'll always use is if you've got a tall beer glass and then a short, wide Scotch glass, and you have them full of sand and you pour water into them and come back in a half an hour, that tall beer stein is going to be pretty wet at the bottom and pretty dry the other 2/3. That Scotch glass, because it's short and wide, is going to be much more uniform in the moisture. And so it just makes your moisture management that much easier. We're also dealing with really rich organic soil, which holds a lot of water and has a lot of weight to it. Add in another 12 inches, another 6 inches adds, you know, a lot of weight and a lot of water weight. And so, yeah, for me, I like a shallower bed.
I was going to chime in. We haven't determined what the minimum depth is for growing in beds and constantly testing and recycling the soil. So, but what we have found is facilities like Gold Leaf, where Ben works as well as a research scientist. 10 inches has been sufficient, and there's multiple places we work with that have gone with 10 inches, and that's just a nice one, because if you have a 12-inch bed, you have a nice little 2-inch lip to keep things from spilling out. And I don't see any advantage really to going a lot deeper than that. You know, we haven't done a side-by-side. Here at my place, I'm a little bit deeper than that, but only because I had an excessive amount of soil and I just wanted to fill the bed up more, because the beds were so deep from Grassroots, but I don't think I needed that much soil. Yeah, does anyone want to add anything to that?
Just
Yeah,
for the
you
record,
can. Oh, go ahead, Brady.
just to say, if you want to buy more soil from KiS, we're happy to do that. But
Sure.
a
Yeah.
lot of I end up talking people, they're like, okay, well, I've got 18 or 24 inches, and we end up talking them out of buying a bunch of soil just because it's going to make their life a lot easier as the grower, you know.
Also, I'll mention the math works out really well. So a 4x4 works out perfectly for a half a yard of soil. So yeah, like Brandon said, we've had people call up and say, I need 100 yards of soil. And then we redo the math and we're like, you only need 60, you know, and that's thousands of dollars in savings in freight and cost on soil. On that note, that's also why I personally prefer the shorter blue mat carrots, because I know that was a question someone's asking about too. I don't like the really deep carrots because I want to know my soil moisture closer to the surface for the most part, unless I have a really, really deep bed. But even then, I haven't seen any data to support needing a deeper carrot. So I almost exclusively use the short carrots with cannabis. If we're talking about like a fruit tree or something, then that's a different conversation. But soil's going to dry out from the top first. I want to keep that point moist. So that's sort of where I want to be sensing soil tension. Ben, do you want to touch on that at all?
Yeah, for sure. The thing too to think about again from a facility and production standpoint is depending on the size of bed you're growing in, you're going to likely be bringing in 6 to 9, maybe 12 gallons of soil every transplant round because you're going to be adding those 1 gallons if that's what you're growing in. So if you do start your beds with less than the lip, then you're going to actually get quite a few rounds before you have to deal with taking soil out of the bed because you've, continually added more as you go through the rounds. Same thing for soil moisture. You guys can think of water as kind of like a pyramid. So when it drops onto the surface, it kind of does this kind of thing. So at some point, if you have too much, volume in your beds because of how, the cycle of the plants and, 70 some odd days, you're just not going to be accessing that bottom horizon of your soil. It's just going to sit there, maybe go anaerobic if you're not careful. So you're basically making things easier on yourself for a few different reasons by not just going like, I'm going to have an 18-inch, 16-inch bed. We at Gold Leaf, the max we'll do is 12 inches, and that's after probably a half a dozen, maybe 8 or so rounds of just adding 9 gallons every transplant to each bed. And then eventually we'll take it out. What we do with that, we'll actually let it rest. We'll put it back in a tote and take it outside and let it sit for a year. And then after that, we'll actually reuse it and turn that back into, veg mix that we'll reuse to shuffle in with some new stuff and just kind of keep it sustainable as possible.
Were you doing the bottomless plots or planting directly in your beds?
It's a really good question. Tad and I just talked about this a couple hours ago. We just go straight into beds. It's a trial that we're going to try to get going on here pretty soon. I know that Green Life Productions does great with that methodology of just plopping those things right on the bed. My questions that we want to investigate are one, like how much height do you lose, if any? You're sitting on top of a bed now. And secondly, I really want to get at, and I haven't figured out how we're going to do this yet, but I would really love to figure out the lag time between, when you put that pot on top of your soil surface versus getting that rhizosphere already down into a network of roots and mycorrhizae and all sorts of stuff that were there from the previous round. And how fast can those handshakes happen? And does that show up in your results? Whether that's yield or quality, cannabinoid, all that kind of fun stuff. But that's my thinking as far as the reason why I'm not out here just, slinging them, because I really don't know yet if the time it takes for those roots to be like, oh yeah, this looks cool and get down into there versus just them already showing up there.
Yeah. I mean, anecdotally, I would say from my experience, there's a little bit of a difference, but also I kind of like the idea of removing the root mass every time too, because I'm scared of HLVD and stuff.
That's right. Yeah. And we do that when we go straight into the soil. We'll pull the main root ball up. We'll shake off most of that dirt though, because that's the gold. That's that, handshake between mycorrhizal and all those inoculants that we want to try to keep in there. And then recharge them with some amendments, and plants are in the next day.
Justin has large beds, Mako Farms. He does not. He ends up with an excess amount of soil as well. So he's probably at this point got 20 or 30 yards of soil that he's moved out of the facility, and he's afraid of bringing that back in, because if he did have, like, let's say you had some root aphids or something like that, you're potentially bringing it back into your veg room. So that's one risk. Or if, it's going outside, you could be bringing in rips or, other exterior pests potentially back into your room. So he made a decision to always use fresh soil to start his veg, because, your veg has to be your mother's, and then your veg has to be the cleanest place in your facility. Gold leaf, less stressed about it. They move it out for a year, tote it up, it stays in the back in. But that is something to consider in your decision making on reusing soil once it's, once your bed gets too full. So I just wanted to touch on that. Sorry, go ahead, Louisa.
He's got a potato farm next door, and potatoes, root aphid. They go hand in hand like peanut butter and jelly. And so after getting bit by root aphids in the previous grows, he's decided not to risk it.
We could finish up about watering. We had a lot of questions about blue mats, a lot of which you've already answered, but do have a question from Nathaniel. His question's about watering after transplanting. He asks about how to water before and when to do water after. He feels his plants often stall at transplant, and also he asks when to add blue mats, retransplanting. Should you wait for roots to get to the bottom, or should you add blue mats right away and always keep soil saturated?
I can start with that if you like. All very, very good questions. And it's going to be maybe a little bit of a frustrating answer, because so much of it depends on your environment and your grow room, whatever you're doing it in, because it really is a matter of how much those plants are transpiring and how fast they're going through whatever water you're giving them. At the facility, our flower rooms will get hit. The previous day, they will get hit with almost a good flush, not a crazy flush, but we will try to move some of those that built up sodium. I mean, we're, for what it's worth, again, at Gold Leaf, I think we're coming up, Tad, what is it? I think 9 years of reusing the same soil. We're getting there. So sodium can show up every now and then because we've been using the same medium over and over again. So we will do a flush, in which case those beds are ultra wet. We don't really have that impact too much, though. They'll still go in the next day. They get hit with a compostee right after transplant, regardless. So those beds are very, very wet. And based on our environmentals, the size of the rooms, airflow, all that stuff, it's actually not until 10 more days until that soil's back within range to where we want to put those blue mats back in. And that's been all figured out just by trial and error of, using the moisture meters and, testing a bunch of beds and figuring out the sweet spot of that 80 to 100, maybe 140 MBAR. And that's when that kind of levels out, and then the blue mats go in. When to put blue mats in, again, that's going to depend heavily on how much water you're adding pre, during, post transplant. And then you're really just going to want to keep an eye on the moisture levels in the, whether you want to spot check like randomly. So go to a container or a bed and just say, literally throw a dart and be like, I want to know what it is here. And then I want to know what it is here. And then another really valuable method to keeping an eye on moisture level is, get like a plastic chopstick and put a little piece of flagging tape on it and just stick it in the bed or in a container somewhere at the exact same spot. And then that's your sensing spot. So every time you want to take a soil moisture reading, if you've got a meter, you go right chopstick, put it in the exact same spot. So that way you have a consistent spot to get a sense of how fast water might be moving through. So there's pros and cons to both of those different methods as far as figuring out exactly what your soil moisture is and when to install blue mats. That's pretty much it. And in that process, you're going to learn a lot about your room just by experimenting and figuring out when do I put that one question. You're going to be like, holy smokes, like I watered these beds to 20 MBAR, for example, and then I'm on day 7 and we're, at 50, right? And that really is the kind of like, holy smokes, they don't need that much water. Or, oh my God, my room's super hot. I'm on day 4 and I'm at 160. Like, whoops. So that's that kind of experimentation that, just the question of when do I put blue mats in can really be a very powerful learning experience for how your plants interact with their environment.
And I did just want to add real quick, sometimes people miss a step on transplanting because their plants are slightly overwatered or very saturated before they go into the beds. So I always let my veg plants dry down before transplanting into the bed. That way they're like hungry for the water, and any soil without root mass is probably going to hold or retain extra water. So having those plants be really hungry for water drives the roots down further into the bed faster, and you're going to have a less likely time of overwatering. Like Ben said, even if it's really wet bed, the plants will have a time to bounce back as long as you don't continue watering. If you're watering every day and the soil's wet, those plants could have serious side effects, if not slow down growth altogether.
Yeah,
that's a good point, Andrew. Oh, I'll go real fast, Brandon. But basically, I just want to say some best practices with transplanting. Make sure to transplant at the optimal time for that plant, which means the roots are just reaching the edge of the pot. They're not starting to wrap around or girdle. I see photos all the time on social media where people are like, look at my healthy roots. And it's really just root girdling because the roots have already started circling around. And if that is the case, because it happens, you need to really be aggressive and actually cut and break up those roots. Otherwise, the plant will continue to struggle, because where growth happens or where nutrient exchange happens is at the root tip. So if that root tip is circling back into the plant, it's not able to access all the soil. And coming from a nursery background, when you buy a nursery plant, a lot of them are already girdled. And so if you just take that plant, let's call it a rose or an arborvitae or whatever, and just plant it right in the ground like that, you can come back 6 months later and that root ball will look exactly the same, because the roots aren't able to work out into the soil. We don't have that same issue in cannabis indoors because we're using all the same media. But if you do plant outdoors, same sort of thing. Make sure to mix in some of your native soil with maybe some 50-50 with compost and create a transition into your native soil if that's what you're going into, rather than into your beds. Also, like Andrew mentioned, the other thing that's really important is making sure that your plant is not too wet going in, because you want to water a transplant. That's just really important. So that means your plants have to be ready to accept water. I mean, they don't need to be super dry, but they should be ready for a watering event at the time of transplant. So plan that. And then after you water them in thoroughly, you are waiting longer, because just right after transplant, your plants it's going to take a while for those roots to really start growing, that plant to take off. So that's going to be probably the biggest gap that you have from a watering perspective for the entire cycle of the plant. Short of when you first plant your rooted clone, the same sort of principles. So, Brandon, go ahead. I just wanted to get that stuff in there.
Oh, no, you covered it, but in the same way that we're trying to coax, roots to come out of a plug, we want to do the same thing when we're planting. And so I think Andrew and Ted covered that.
The thing too, guys, if you are going to be transplanting from one container, pulling it out of that, examine the roots, look at it, and also keep an eye on the soil moisture of that pot or that container that you're going to be going in, right? Because if that's dry enough and you water your bed, it might not be getting anything, right? That soil that in the first container might be hydrophobic to the point where everything else, and you're planted and everything, right? So it looks good, but that cube might just have shed water already and you wouldn't know it. So you'd want to make sure that you're at the appropriate moisture level in your veg pots before you go into your beds. Otherwise, you're going to think you're doing fine, and that might be another reason for slowdown too. If people are, thinking that, well, I want my plants to be thirsty and they dry them out a little too much, and then you're watering, but that stuff's not even really registering to the plant.
So Brandon posted this in the chat, and because I know people aren't going to be able to see the chat when they watch, if they come back and watch the recording, I just want to get that into the recording, which is that if you want to do a light compost tea, aerated compost tea, or a light fish hydrolysate application for that watering event that you do at Transplant, that can also help too. Just give them a little bit of available nutrition as they're switching over into the new transplanted soil. I think that's a great idea.
Yeah, that was just a challenge for me when I started with organics, because I wasn't used to being having salt experience. I was like, what's this stall out? What's this 1 week, 2 week stall out? I don't have time for this. The aerated compost tea and fish hydro just gets me right through that.
Ben, there's a question for you in the chat. What is your facility's protocol for bringing in soil back in from outside? Do you do any IPM? Are you re-amending that soil before you store it outside? So those amendments have time to break down. Are you watering in any microbes to facilitate the breakdown?
Yeah, it's a really good question. We do a couple of things. First is when we put it outside, we do tie the toad up so it's not just got all sorts of nonsense falling into it. We let it a solid year, and that thing will freeze and then get really hot, and that whole cycle happens. When we do come bring it back in, we do make our own lactobacillus, so we'll put some of that through there. And then it will get recharged with some amendments. And then the other thing that's helping us is it's not like it's going from a rested state to an empty bed. It's also going to be going back in with the native soil that's still being used in the facility. So there's going to be a lot of already happy microbes and good things that's already there, to compete with anything that might be bad that's coming in. So that's the other thing to think about with organics is, a lot of these big bad microbes that we talk about, they all have competition in our system. So yeah, they're probably in there, but they're at such a low population number relative to the other things, just because they're all competing for the same resources. We don't really ever see any flare-ups of anything too gnarly, but yeah, super good question. So we do a lab. We recharge with microbes, the compost teas that we add. So we try to bring out the populations of the really good stuff. And I think it's a fool's errand to try to make sure that you're not going to have any bad guys in there, because we're talking about, trying to do this organically. But as long as you're giving your helpful warriors enough food, rest, and whatever, they should be able to outcompete anything that's gonna end up biting you in the butt.
I think regular applications of either trichoderma or lab or rotating them is something every facility, like, you could get away with not doing it at home, because if you lose a 4x4, it's not the end of the world. But at a facility, it would be part of my protocol that I was doing one of those every week. Just it's going to outcompete. And there's some, like one of the things that lactobacillus, one of its exudates, one of the things it poops out is oxalase. Oxalase helps drive terpene and trichome production. So win-win. But definitely be doing something to keep your soil microbes, the good guys, able to outcompete the bad guys. Everybody in this chat's got Fusarium and Botrytis on their face right now. You cannot exclude it. Just outcompete it.
We have a question from Keith. How do you use the PACE test to help you create a soil prescription? How does knowing what is in the soil solution help you know what to put in the soil? I think this one's for you, Brandon.
So I'm looking at the PACE test. I'm using both. I use the Malic 3, the soil report, as kind of my savings account. And then the paste reports what's available now. That's what's in your pocket or in your wallet, purse, whatever. And the paste, I'm mostly looking for bad actors, chlorides. I'm looking at sulfur on the paste as opposed to, I don't look at sulfur on the Malic 3. I just want to see what's available. Sulfur is something that, like phosphorus, I'm also looking at the available phosphorus. They both can sit in the soil for a long time before they're liberated. So I really want to see what that available level for both of those are. I really want to see that available phosphorus so I can compare it back to the reserve to see how efficiently you're cycling. If you've got a really nice reserve, but you've got really poor cycling and or low available phosphorus, then we're going to look into why it's not, is it temperature? Is there just not enough biology? Is it not the right biology? Microbial mass, mammoth P, tribus. I think somebody did ask about different phosphorus solubilizing bacteria, and those are 3 good ones. I've seen really good stuff already from the microbial mass, the folks that are using it. Microbial mass is also supposed to liberate calcium, so another win-win. But I want to see those numbers. I want to see if like I saw a bunch of tests today with really poor reserve, but better than normal available. That tells me that the grower is feeding some sort of, they're pHing with phosphoric acid, they're feeding with fish hydrolysate, but they're doing some sort of supplemental feeding. And so that just tells me something about the grow, so I can kind of understand what that grower's doing a little bit, because I personally am trying to set my grow up for a one-time pre-plant amendment application, and that's it. Then I'll do my little potassium thing at the end of week 3, but that's how I'd like to do my fertilizer routine, so I don't have to worry about it. I can just kind of forget about it. I also, and then the real money on the pace report is the cations. And one, I'm looking for the actual balance of what your plant is seeing. I'm looking for to try to hit my target metrics, but to make sure you're in balance. It's going to give me some information if you're seeing something weird on your plant. That's where I'm going to look at it. And I do look at the Malic 3 for the cation numbers, but we can go back to book club and doing Steve Solomon's approach, which is I would agree that that's the right approach for outdoor grow. We're going to balance off of that. We're going to look at sulfur, phosphorus, everything on that. But with a potting substrate where the total exchange capacity is just not accurate, we can't balance that way. And so we need to see what's available to the plant, and the pace report gives us a way to do that and a way to make sure that there's sufficient nutrient and balance. So
we had a couple of questions about phosphorus cycling. I think you've covered some of it, Brandon, and we have talked about it in the book club. The recordings are all available on Patreon. Pete asks, what are phosphorus sources and bacteria that cycle phosphorus? And Greg also, he's noticed through rounds of amending that his beds, in his beds, that phosphorus never seems to cycle at a rate we'd want to see it at. And he asks if there's any option to do something like vermicomposting with bone meal to really target castings that would be high in phosphorus while trying to minimize heavy metal inputs.
Jump in that, and then I think Tad was just talking to Bryant about some of that. As far as the specific biology, I think we already touched on that. Stuff like microbial mass, mammoth P, that's bacteria that specifically targets phosphorus solubilizing. So that would be what I would use for that. Phosphorus sources. We talked about this in book club, but in the pursuit of, and it was my challenge thing is heavy metals. So in the pursuit of managing heavy metals, we've really reduced our rock inputs, our soft rock phosphate. It's still a really good input. I don't like to do guanos just because it's not sustainable. There's a bunch of environmental impacts and potential bacterial infections that can be passed along that way. It's just not it's not the path forward. Fishbone or bovine, those are really good sources. They're going to bring in nitrates as well. So you just need to make sure that you're balancing, that you're managing your nitrates so that you're low enough at the end of the round that you can use bone meal or fishbone meal to bring in phosphorus. That way you don't have to lean on soft rock. My favorite's CalPhos, just based off the California registry. It has the best heavy metal numbers. So that's the one I would use there. And then as far as compost and vermicompost, that does seem to be obviously that's going to be very labor intensive and would depend on if, Greg is somebody that's, obviously capable and would be willing to do the labor to do something like that. Home grow, you just might not have the space to do that. And so it might just be better to really super load up your reserves, go way over your target and then just do weekly applications of microbial mass or Mammoth P. But I have read stuff. I've not personally done it, but we talked about that in book club as well. I think last week or the one before, where Steve was suggesting putting phosphorus sources into compost or vermicompost so that it would be, we were talking about particle size, and the more something's broken down, the more readily available it will be, and that sort of stuff. And so it would follow that adding phosphorus source to compost would make it more available. And so that would be a good long-term project. It wouldn't be a quick fix. A quick fix would be something like Pacific Grove CFOS, just a liquid, low nitrogen cheat. And pHing with phosphoric acid is a great way to have available P. So I think I answered all that.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. So we're trying to wrap up. Does anyone have any final questions?
I do. Did we get even close to answering questions?
Yeah, we've covered about maybe 50-60% of questions that came up. So I mean, by all means, we can do this again, or we can try and cover some of the questions either on IG or on Patreon. I mean, we have a lot of food for thought. So
one note to add, just because, two notes. So the first thing on the phosphorus thing, from a plant perspective, if your plant needs available phosphorus, phosphoric acid is the best option, even though it's not organic. Just in terms of the plant doesn't care if your nitrate comes from calcium nitrate, not organic, or fish meal, for example. So I just want to mention that. So when people are thinking about options, now fish hydrolysate is stabilized with phosphoric acid, and that's sort of the cheat on that in terms of the National Organic Program of what they allow, because it stabilizes the fish. So that some people are gonna be like, nope, I'm not gonna touch that because it's not truly organic, and I totally respect that. I think that's fine. But for people that are less concerned about that sort of organic, synthetic conventional argument, phosphoric acid is the easiest way to get your P levels up. And bat guanos is another one, but there's a lot of reasons not to use those. But I see when people add bat guanos into their soil, their available P is quite high. And then just the other thing I want to mention to you guys, totally unrelated to the Q&A, but we just set up the Discord. So you should be able to share your own grow on there, and people can comment on it. So people can have their own, posts or channels. And then we can all chat on there better than Patreon, because
I'm going to
I know that was something that we want to add.
I'm going to send out an invite for that to everybody tomorrow.
Sweet. I'm looking
I
forward
will-
to seeing everyone's growing there too.
Yeah.
Did you guys want me to touch real quick on a low heavy metal compost mix that people can try?
Sure.
So you could just use peat moss because peat moss is usually very low in heavy metals, and then we've also found that so base of peat moss, which is probably going to be what's in your growing media anyway, so it'll mix well if you're using it to amend. And then you can just add fish bone, gypsum, and insect grass, and all those have very low levels of arsenic. Gypsum will have a tiny bit of lead, so if you are worried about lead, leave the gypsum out. But if you add something like ag lime or other calcium sources, most of those come with some arsenic. So it's kind of a battle. You got to pick most of the time between arsenic or lead. Unfortunately, Calphos has a little bit of both, which is why we've been reducing it in our mixes and leaning on the fishbone, because the fishbone is just super clean, and the insect frass that we have right now is super clean. So you could get a very high phosphorus based casting with a good reserve of calcium that is virtually arsenic free with a little bit of lead from the gypsum. And then if you take out the gypsum, there is calcium in fishbone, and worms naturally coat their castings in a calcium bicarbonate. So there should, in theory, be enough calcium without the gypsum, but the extra calcium and sulfate that comes with the gypsum, I love that combination when we're talking about cannabis. So personally, if I was going to set up like an ultra clean vermicomposting setup, I would amend peat moss with insect frass, fishbone, and gypsum. Add my worm population once I made sure that that was not enough to heat up the peat in any way. So once I know that it's a safe environment, add your worms, and there's really not going to be much of a resting period needed for that type of a mix.
And you can hit us up if you want to know the brands that we've tested, because depending on where the gypsum's mined, it'll have different levels of heavy metals. So don't just think that all gypsum's the same. Just want to throw that out there.
Yeah, sorry. These are specifically the products that we stock are the ones that we've tested. I couldn't speak to every brand, and gypsum is one of those things where the lower the quality, the more heavy metals you'll see. So don't skimp on the gypsum just because you think you can get it from the paint shop down the street.
Good tip.
Well, you can always get the brands that we carry, but yeah, sorry. Go ahead, Louisa.
No, I was just saying those are good tips, and it's probably a good place to finish. And like Brandon said, we'll try and address the other questions that came in some way, somehow. And yeah, we look forward to doing this again soon. Thanks everybody for coming.
Yeah, that was fun. Thanks, guys.
Great. Thanks everybody.
Thanks, you guys. Thanks for the great
Thank you.
questions.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye.